Today on AI Actually, the $10 trillion AI opportunity, forward deployed engineers, year of the agent reality check, and Replit hands-on feedback.
It does feel like most of this $10 trillion opportunity is just a matter of time.
If you're 3 months behind, you might as well be, a year behind because the gap is so big.
The better you can define the task and the boundaries around that, the better likelihood that you're going to get a reasonable result.
Great. Welcome back to the podcast, everybody. We got a full house today. We got Alone, our founder and fearless leader. We've also got Shanti Green. Shanti Green tells me he was doing data science before data science was cool. And
right.
I hear he's prone to wear lots of AI devices and experiment with all sorts of things.
I just learned that it's cool. Wow.
Yeah. And Stu, speaking of cool, Stu has actually run some pretty serious gaming companies and probably one of the earliest of early adopters in AI. And so we've got folks in here with tech chops and business chops, and hopefully have a great discussion. Wanted to start with, there was a video I watched, and we'll include it in a link to the show notes. It was from Sequoia, and they were talking about, it really had a couple of sort of threads in it that I thought would be worth picking up. And a part of the thread was around how general purpose technologies like the steam engine, became used in the economy and how that sort of triggered economic growth and so on. And a lot around specialization. And then there was a whole another section around what they see as this $10 trillion opportunity with agents to automate a huge portions of the services segment of the economy. And so wanted to just get started on that, give you guys some thoughts on that and how we can connect that for our enterprise customers. Shanti, I think I'd like to tee that up for you and just sort of get your initial take and have other folks jump in.
Yeah, I've got definitely some thoughts. I think speed-wise, this is a huge breakthrough in terms of how quickly people are adopting new technology and how quickly things are changing. It's changing daily. Our capabilities are jumping daily too. It's not this linear progression, but what we can do today could be very different than what we were able to do yesterday. So in that sense, I think the Industrial Revolution is a good analogy, and we might even be moving faster. 10 trillion, I think, is a number, and the quantitative person inside of me says, how did they come up with that? There's a very ballpark estimation. Some people call it McKinsey math that goes on behind that type of number, but I think it'll be big. I don't know that we can actually quantify it right now, but I think it's a big deal. And we're going to see a lot of different places where AI is going to be able to automate some processes that we didn't think could be automated, and other places where it's being shoehorned in and shouldn't be.
I think the math boils from just looking at labor, right?
What the service economy?
Yeah, service economy. What is it worth versus the sort of software, SaaS economy? So the numbers can get big, but obviously it implies very broad adoption across lots of sectors. And so, the number is big, as I think everybody acknowledges. I think the path to get there, though, is very uneven because. So look, in software, we're using a ton, right? Software development, we're using a ton of agents. I was checking on our bill, say, okay, is our bill climbing? Are we actually seeing adoption in a positive sense, right? I want to see it rising. We have lots of folks engaging. But it's also hard to point a finger at. People can show you, okay, I did this more productively. Are you shipping features faster at the end of the day? Are you actually able to get across the goal line? We've talked about this before. That's much harder math. Right. It's much harder to say that these specific features were shipped in a 10x sort of way. What I feel like what we're seeing is 10x the number of really good prototypes of things. And then we get to pick and choose what we invest in more. And then, of course, there are areas where I would say, here's a utility or a process that was kind of automated. So in software development, I think the entire cycle, there are places where we're seeing productivity gains, but there's still bottlenecks in spots that are, as long as there's human beings that have to do certain things, whether it's, you need the right taste for the thing or the right judgment call, there's still some impedance to getting this sort of 10x output on overall productivity. So, and I think the main point from the industrial age in this was, it took a long time to get this right. Like, just because you had a steam power didn't mean that all of a sudden things were rolling off the factory floor. So we could be critical of, the last 12 months, but give this 10 years. I mean, who knows how far this gets, in that time.
Will you buy, okay, so this is the $10 trillion number. It's a big number. Are you buying the idea that a lot of work will be automated? The work of BPO companies, the work
Yeah.
of agencies, and so on.
Yeah. Seems inevitable in some, but maybe not as fast as some of those trajectories show. That's really the hard part is, are we really on, when is this exponential curve? How does it really hit productivity versus I could claim that, 50% of my code base was written by AI. Sure. But I have to review that code base and I have to tell it, don't do it this way. And it outputted 100 more lines of code than I wanted it to, that I then told it to, do in a different way. And so like, it's not a 1-for-1 measure, I guess, to the way I would think of,
And I feel like there's a limit on what these organizations can absorb. I talk to a lot of companies and I ask them about, what are you guys doing? And they'll say, oh, we've got a ChatGPT enterprise license, which is great, but right, it gets started, but it's a far cry from, automating your accounts receivable.
right.
Yeah. I think a lot of on especially the marketing side of things, their ability to move quickly by generating boilerplate content and then make small edits to it is really improving. So things that would take 2 weeks, 3 weeks, and a team of people are now being done with 1 to 2 people, and they're being done in a day.
And
Yeah.
a lot
I
of
mean, I think it's, yeah. I mean, I think it was Bill Gates. It was someone like that, always said people tend to overestimate what'll happen in the next 3 years and underestimate what'll happen in 10 years with technology. It's probably true. There's always certain stuff that's going to get in and slow things down. At the same time, a lot of this technology is moving, at a nonlinear rate. So I think, we're pretty bad at predicting how nonlinear trends go over time. So I think it's really transformative. I think the thing that'll really drive right now, AI is still mostly limited to, in terms of job replacement and or job radical changes, things like that, to jobs that can be done in front of a computer, all right, that are fully digital. I think it's robotics will be where things get really nuts, but I think that's you're way earlier on that curve too. And I think, that'll take a while for that to really sort its way out into the economy. But there's no doubt that, there's lots of opportunity there, I think, for every company or individual to use this technology to do things that maybe they were possible 3 years ago, but didn't make sense economically because they would have been too hard. And now they're just, easy enough that there's ROI on them or whatever. So I think there's a lot of stuff like that.
I think the interesting question is if you work it backwards and say, why can't AI do a certain job? And when do I think he'll be able to do it? It's hard to say, no, we won't be able to do that, right? Like for most jobs that we're talking about that are knowledge worker, on keyboard, in front of a computer kinds of jobs, if you pinpoint I made this decision this way, I chose this, I chose that, most of the time it's you can't do it because it doesn't have the right context. Like some of the information that's in your brain isn't sitting in somewhere digitized. But that feels a little bit like the internet, right? When it started, there was not enough content on it, and there are lots of things that you can go find over time. What won out is the fact that it was much easier to publish content and for more people to see it on the internet. So it does feel like most of this $10 trillion opportunity is just a matter of time.
It's time.
Probably won't even think of it that way, right? By the time it happens, they'll just feel like, yeah, it's a natural tool to doing the job.
Mm-hmm.
One of the other points that he makes in the video that resonated with me was around, he makes the argument that, well, we had the steam engine and it took us, I don't know what it was, 50 years to have the first factory. And then it was another 50 years to have a lot of factories. And his argument was it was all around taking that general purpose technology and specializing it. How do you guys think that applies in this world?
Yeah, I think when you get into specialty AI and building agents that do specific tasks, you're able to give them more of that context around what you need it to do, which makes them much more capable of actually getting you to the result that you want. And the better you can define the task and the boundaries around that, the better likelihood that you're going to get a reasonable result.
Yeah. I think the momentum for me, is kind of shifted from, when we first saw the let's say 3.5, GPT 3.5, that was pretty good at doing some things. I'm like, okay, these models can keep growing and just generalize really well and do all kinds of things. I think the momentum has really swung. If you start looking at work tasks, that specialization and application scaffolding becomes super important. So the amount of time that it takes to build all that scaffolding is not instantaneous, right? You can't just train it in. You actually have to sit down and thoughtfully engineer systems that redo the workflow in an optimal way. And so I think that time that, there's a difference between re-implementing a factory versus re-implementing software. So it's much quicker to re-implement software in a sense, but it still takes time. So you're talking in months and short number of years probably, as opposed to decades. But to do all that $10 trillion worth of work, I can imagine there's a lot of software required to be written. Arguably, there's a replacement for every bit of software that you use today. Arguably, there's a replacement over the next decade to do it in a more AI native way.
Someplace I'm noticing where like sticking points are really about those integrations where how do I get my LLM or my agent model to talk to this other tool? And how do I make sure that it uses like my authentication to go through it and not generic ones? I was trying to build one to just like read my email of AI newsletters, of which I have way too many, follow all the links to get the full story, do some summarization on those. I created like some impact factor and other things that I wanted to see. But I wanted to then like write those to Google Drive. And I can't believe how difficult that is. Like this is a very common cloud storage platform. Why is this step hard?
Yeah. There are little edges.
Do you guys think companies, I mean, obviously it's one thing we've got SaaS companies, Oracle and ServiceNow and Salesforce and so on. They all have their own sort of their approach, right? They want you to adopt their agents and use their agentic framework and so on. When you talk to companies, I just had this conversation this week with a company that was talking about onboarding suppliers, like, oh, you have to go to Salesforce and then you go to Oracle and then you go to ServiceNow and orchestrating all that. Talk about going well beyond Google Drive, right? A, that sounds pretty challenging. B, I don't know that the folks that we're talking to have an understanding of how to even approach that. What's your what have you seen out there? Do you feel like people really are getting that? And what kinds of things should they really be thinking about to capitalize on this opportunity?
Yeah. Actually, I had a discussion with someone earlier this week as well, and just kind of decomposing, anything you start to, at a business level, once you start decomposing a process, right, into a bunch of different things, it's always a little more messy and complicated on the ground than you think it is, and I think that's where a lot of the work is right now. And Alone kind of touched on an interesting point that I didn't want to miss that I think ties back into this, which is I don't think now the bottlenecks are the models getting a lot smarter, right? I think, even if the models got a lot smarter, I don't even know how much it would gain us, except for in some very specialized areas today. I think and when I say smarter, I mean just like the raw intelligence leap that maybe you saw between a GPT 3.5 and GPT 4 or something. I think everything now is in this scaffolding around the intelligence that's already there is where all the bottlenecks are. And some of that is what some of the things Alone touched on in terms of just having better tooling and better ways of bringing the right context into bear. And some of that is getting the right ways where you can decompose a multi-step process, kind of like what Shanti was describing, right? And get it into a workflow and a code and in much better ways. And it's rapidly improving. I mean, that's stuff, man, what you can do now is so much better than what you could do in January. It's insane, but I think it's still work and it's very unevenly distributed on the knowledge, right? I think it's changing so rapidly. Most people are still a year behind. And if you're 3 months behind, you might as well be, a year behind because the gap is so big.
Pete, back to your question around, there are a lot of systems that usually are involved, a lot of bits of software involved in any enterprise process, right? That spans onboarding a supplier, onboarding a person, right? These are things that inevitably, I don't know, the average enterprise has got 50 plus tools that you have to touch and learn. So the question of how do agents and AI help there, and who's going to bring those to the table? I think it is, there's a series of sort of AI opportunities all around this orchestration layer. You're starting to see it, like if you think from a consumer perspective, using something like Operator, where it's along for the ride and your browser, and it's doing the work that you would naturally do. So in other words, perceiving the world from the perspective of a user and just sort of taking the steps that you would have taken using the browser is kind of the way to touch all those systems. That feels like the kind of an early thing that we'll have, because It doesn't require every bit of software to get rewritten, right? It's just a piece of software that acts like a user on existing bit of software, but it's also very inefficient. It's also runs into all the same traps that a user does, where if you click the wrong thing, you end up in some state that you didn't want to be in, and you have to backtrack and all that. So it's definitely not, you can't operate at the speed of software by clicking on buttons like a user. So I think what will emerge from that pattern is that every company that offers enterprise functionality will have APIs and endpoints that are designed for agentic use, that are not user first,
Right.
they're really agent first.
Right.
And that I think will create a huge productivity boost to the folks who are building the orchestration layers. That's starting to happen. You're starting to see it with sort of tech companies leading the way, where they're publishing their documents, they're publishing in a way that's consumable by AI models, they're publishing endpoints that are MCP server based, and other ways to consume them. But that will take time. That will take a lot of software to get all the way there. Meanwhile, we'll probably have to limp along with some, simulation of users to the best we can.
Yeah, there's
Yeah,
an interesting missing component there of the documentation for those things, even for standard APIs, can be really bad, because a lot of times it was created after the fact. Like they had APIs they were using internally. They said, let's expose some of these. Nobody bothered to document them. We've been working on a project like that where some of these sources just we guessed at V1 documentation. So we're like, I wonder if they have a V2. We replaced a URL and found V2. It wasn't documented anywhere. All of the endpoints are different and give different kinds of results in V2. So we have options now.
So it sounds like we would all agree that, yeah, it's going to require a pretty decent amount of specialization into a business, into a workflow, into a process to really bring this stuff to life. And it's probably a lot more work than the first level, which was, hey, let's get ChatGPT and sort of gather our documents together, and we have a chatbot. It's a lot more involved than that. So I was going to shift gears. There was another video that I shared. I think Stu, you may have been the first one to share it, so I appreciate you doing that. It was about, the topic was around Palantir has this model they call the forward deployed engineer. And Alon, you've been talking about this for years, I think, around how much of that should we use, and how should we leverage that. I thought it was interesting. Obviously, the video was talking to startups and how startups might use this process. But I kept thinking, well, I think we use a lot of that process. I think a lot of our customers could learn a lot from the process in terms of how to leverage AI. So, Alon, you've been a big proponent of, or sort of have talked about this process a good bit. Maybe you could start off by talking a little bit about why you saw that, and sort of how you see it applying to bringing AI.
I mean, I think for us, it was born out of kind of necessity, right? When we were building early products, the engineers were also the salespeople and also the support people. Inevitably, you end up sitting in a video rental store writing code that matched, the situation you just saw, or a convenience store, wherever the customers were at the time. And so for me, the lesson there was, it's very powerful if the folks who are building the product are as intimate as possible with the customer. And not just what the customer says, but what they do and how they do it. So you end up being forward deployed, means you're, out in the field with the customers wherever they are, learning very quickly, right? And iterating very quickly. So that's the basis. Now, as systems get more complex and you end up with more specialized roles, it's hard to bring a huge team on site to do all of that in parallel. But I think the desire to keep teams kind of smaller and closer to the customer is always the most productive possible thing you can do in engagements.
Yeah, one of the things that they talk about, which resonated with me, was this idea that we're at this stage with AI, is that nobody knows exactly how to do all these things, and nobody knows, especially as you get into these specialized processes and so on. And they talk about this idea that you've sort of got to do something that feels unscalable at first, and then really sort of iterate and try to figure out how to scale it. And so I was just thinking, I don't know, Stu, it'd be interesting to get your perspective on this. I was thinking that there's lessons to be learned for our customers, people that we're working with that are trying to get the most out of AI in terms of how to think about that methodology and how they can use it to spin up these use cases.
I think actually it's a lot of what's happening today I mean, I think having forward deployed engineers, we used to call them technical consultants or consulting engineers or whatever, but having engineers that are as close to the customer as possible has always been a good idea, in a lot of cases. But I think it becomes more important at the leading edge of certain technology revolutions. And you really saw this in the 90s. This is how I got my early start to my career in the 90s, which was really the start of, let's call it the information revolution. And this is the start of the intelligence revolution. In the 90s, you first had these systems emerge that really allowed all of this information to come together for the first time and for people to communicate in ways that they hadn't been able to do. And you had to go into every business and figure out, well, what did we do with this? And I remember, my very first job out of college was, this guy had written a book, James Champy had written this book called Re-Engineering the Corporation. Right. And it was based on this fundamental idea that this was even before the internet was super big. It was more just on the emergence of client server network technologies and how this was every company had to go in and re-engineer how all of its process worked. And what you saw through the 90s and early 2000s was a lot of this forward deployed engineer idea. Like I said, they were called maybe something different then. But you had big teams going into organizations to decompose business processes and figure out how to take advantage of this technology. And the big thriving systems were systems like SAP and or PeopleSoft, CRM, ERP type systems that help bring all of this together. And then what happened as that technology matured over time is more and more of the capabilities got productized. Right. But it got productized because these forward deployed engineers were in the field working with customers with a mindset around let's try to learn lessons and generalize where we can. And over time, systems like SAP, PeopleSoft, CRM, ERP, lessons, lots of stuff eventually got generalized more. It went from you having to code these things specifically to them just being, configuration flags or things like that. I think it's a very similar thing now where this big changes come that allows a very new way of working, allows new things to be deployed, but somebody's got to go in there and figure out how the heck do you take advantage of this stuff. And then ideally, whoever's doing that is also thinking about things in a very systematic way and trying to generalize problems wherever possible so that the next job is easier. And I think that's what engineers do well, when they're very good. And so I think this idea of having forward deployed engineers is more important now than it has been in a while.
I mean, when you look at how we run a services engagement, the first thing we want to do is set up those workshops for a couple of days where we sit down with the business to understand what are they doing today? What are the pieces of that business that are important to them? And, our job is to bring the expertise in AI and data science and data engineering so we can then say, well, you're doing it this way. Maybe this piece here, we can help you solve that a little more efficiently and a little bit better. And maybe there's this other piece over there. And if you do enough of those little pieces, all of a sudden you're changing the business in a really big way.
I think
Go ahead.
opportunity that has kind of come up is the ability just to quickly prototype stuff now is such that you could very quickly show customers, users like, oh, is this what you mean? Or instead of walking through a slide that they have to use their imagination, they can actually use live software in a prototype mode and really get the dialogue going back and forth in terms of, can we do it this way versus that way? Live almost, right? Or certainly within a matter of hours, as opposed to before, you're like, let's capture all these notes, maybe build mock-ups that are, just visuals, but aren't really interactive at that level. So I think there's a way to close this gap of what functionality do you actually want out of the system and prototype it and get feedback kind of
One
all
of the things they talk about in that video, they talked about, I think they called it the Delta team, which were the developers, and the Echo team, which were, I don't know, I would sort of more talk about sort of the business analyst or the person that really understood the business process really well. They said, but a key ingredient was they needed to be a heretic. They needed to be, was the word they chose, but to say someone who said, yeah, I understand the process, but I understand how it's broken and I understand how to leverage this. What do you guys think? Heretic really important or no? I just got to have deep domain expertise.
I mean, if you're going to do things the same way, you're going to get the same results. So you
Maybe
need
a
to
little
figure
fast
out
change.
what's going to change.
Yeah.
Maybe a
I
little
find that,
fast.
but it's often the case, Pete, that the people who are there already acknowledge and know the things that are broken. And it's not that they can't conceive of how to change them. It's just that they don't have the tools, right? But they could point to many things that are broken. And then the engineering practice behind it is like, okay, this is broken. Here's an optimal way to solve that. And that's also a moving target. Like, I feel like, back to Shanti's earlier discussion about how fast things are changing, like the same advice that we would have given like 6 months ago and like, it's a broken process. You could automate it, with this much AI. And now it's like, well, actually, you should take the whole thing and re-engineer it. So yeah, there's just a much bigger playing field for technology, where before it was limited to, sort of digital optimization of record keeping and maybe heuristics, to now like, well, if you look at the whole process,
Completely reimagined.
yeah, there's only so much human knowledge that's required to get digitized. Only so much human opinion that's required, and judgment that's required in in onboarding a supplier, for instance. You can imagine that whole process, even though it's, probably has talked to 50 systems, there's not a lot of human ingenuity that goes into onboarding a supplier. There's a few decisions maybe, right? So opportunity is a much bigger way. And back to the $10 trillion opportunity, right? That's how it adds up, by all these use cases that suddenly can be automated end to end without a ton of human involvement.
Do you look like
The point I don't want to lose, talked Pete about how they were talking about the business analysts and the engineer side. I think the most interesting, and then I think it was Alone was talking about the speed of prototyping. This to me is the most interesting opportunity, and one like boots on the ground, biggest changes is I don't think it's that business analyst needs to be a heretic. I think because, as Alon pointed out, most people see a lot of the problems anyways. It's not like everyone looks at these things like they're perfect. I think that business analyst, it's actually almost more important for that business analyst to get these new tools and understand how to use them and take advantage of them than it is for the engineer to get these tools and learn how to take advantage of them all. There's a lot of value there, because I think what's stable now, the hardest part is getting that a lot of projects is actually understanding what it is you should do, right? And getting that defined in a way that can be engineered, right? That can actually be put down into a solution. And I think the best business analysts right now are able to use these tools to just explain, to very quickly demonstrate what's possible, what's in their head, and this, we use this discipline, especially in product companies, of product management. Maybe if you're an enterprise, you don't call it a product manager, but it's the same role of kind of this analyst trying to figure out what to build. To me, that's one of the roles that's changing most dramatically. Who is this business analyst? And is the business analyst the actual the person in the seat who's creating the new supplier, for example, or is the business analyst someone else who just kind of fully gets the scope of the business? And I think it varies. I think the best business analysts right now to be able to help with AI deployment, I think have a real, solid understanding of how the business really works, which is maybe slightly different or very different from the whiteboard understanding of how you might think the business work if you haven't actually been involved in actually trying to get the real work done at some level. So it's very often not actually, for example, the executives, right, who maybe have too high a level and understanding of this. I think you've got to get down to a boots on the ground level of understanding what's going on, but are also really passionate about these tools and able to use these tools, understand the capabilities very well, to know what's possible now that wasn't possible a year or two ago, and to use these tools to explain how they think the change can occur and to do rapid prototypes.
Yeah. So what I'm hearing is, lots of good lessons to be learned from this concept. Obviously, it's been around in some form or fashion for a very long time, but getting people that are really close to the business, but to your point, Stu, also have a really good understanding of the capabilities of this technology and an up-to-date understanding, right? Because it's changing every 5 minutes, but have them sort of forward deployed in with the business unit with a deep understanding of how it works today and what the possibilities are to really capture the value. Okay. Well, let's go, Alone, you were saying this is supposed to be the year of the agents, and let's sort of maybe take a checkpoint on where that is. I thought I'd start with that with, I think Replit announced, I think it's called Agent 3, is sort of their third iteration of agents. And I thought it'd be interesting, Stu, since I know you've had a lot of experience with it just this week, to just share your perspective there, sort of the good, the bad, and the ugly, and maybe talk a little bit about more about where we think we are in this sort of the year of the agent.
Replit's a good example where I think there's this report out by Meter, I think, that had the stat going around for a while that says the amount of autonomous time that an agent can work keeps increasing on a non-linear level, right? So basically every 4 to 6 months, it's doubling, meaning an agent, that maybe last 4 months ago could have worked 20 minutes autonomously can now work 40 minutes autonomously with some sort of hit. There's a very specific way it measures it. And I think this Replit thing is interesting. I was traveling yesterday and wanted to build a prototype to illustrate, where an idea of how I thought this technology could help be deployed on a process. And nearly all from my phone was using this Replit to build this prototype. And it actually did quite a good job all from my phone pretty quickly in doing that. And the insights there, actually, I think the coding agent that Replit is using is probably subpar to the state of the art that's out in the world today. It looks like it feels like it's probably like Claude Sonnet 4.0, versus, Claude 4.1, Opus, T5. Had some kind of flaws a few times where I had to yell at it and get it in line. It's not that the coding agent was that superior, but what makes it able to run autonomously and work faster at the end of the day is ultimately its integration with everything else. And so for those that don't know, Replit is a tool where you can build projects, but it's all inside of its own containerized environment. And it's really cool too, because that means you can deploy to production right from there. You can go straight, have a working web app with a URL all from this app really quickly. But I think that fact that it's all kind of in a box and containerized has allowed them to do a much better job of training the models to use the various tools that are useful to help do these coding projects, as well as do testing. And one of the things this thing was doing really well was testing itself, so both back end and front end tasks. And you can see it pop up its browser and it's clicking around and it's trying to test everything and it's coming up with stuff from that. And so it was just much easier to move forward on things because of its tool integration being so well done. And it also can do things because it's all in one containerized package. It can say like, hey, if I'm creating a database by default, unless I'm asked for something else, it's going to be a Postgres database and I'm going to do it in this way, right? I've got my standards of how I'm going to do it. It's not quite as the fact that it's a little more contained of a box lets them build these tools much better and pretty phenomenal. I mean, like what we're able to do, and I'd let it go off for 30 minutes at a time, and I'm not even checking in on the thing. And I come back and it's like, wow, it did a lot in that 30 minutes.
You guys think of this as more of a, I don't know, vibe coder consumer thing, or are there implications for the large companies that we typically work with?
No, I think there's definitely large company implications in this. This being, I would say the agentic,
Won't take
long running agent movement. But if we're just stepping back and say, how's it going this year? I don't think it's lived up to the hype yet, because the hype was so hard to live up to, right? So the hype was, 50% of work, or, some crazy amount of stuff could get done by agents by year end. And now it looks like more like maybe, choose your task carefully and with enough specialized scaffolding and feedback loops. As Stu pointed out, it's a really critical thing for it to test, to be able to verify the work that it's doing against something, right? So if the work is verifiable, great. If the work is not easily verifiable, then you're back in human in the loop for clarification. So I'd say it's tantalizingly close. Like the things that go wrong seem to go wrong in ways that should be correctable. It's like, oh, I underspecified what I told it and it made some assumptions and went off, or it didn't get the nuance of something. Honestly, if there was, an intern on the other side of that, or even, a coworker, most of the time they need some clarification also. They're just probably smarter at knowing when they need clarification as opposed to trying to please you because they've been reinforcement learning that told them you should keep going and, and go, here's the most likely way you should keep going, right? Like the agent just wants to go do the work. It doesn't want to stop. It's sort of reinforcing that direction. So it's not quite, say today's models aren't quite smart enough for that. And then therefore you have to build a considerable amount of scaffolding to keep them on track. So, net to me, it's the right direction. It's going to go there. It's just, it won't be in months. I think it'll be, short number of years as opposed to, short number of months that we'll get there.
Yeah, I played with Replit a good deal and a bunch of the other agentic vibe coding platforms as well. Where Replit in particular was pretty good at building most of the stuff, but you mentioned that it really wants to please you and just keep working. And that got me in so much trouble because it needed to reach out and hit these APIs and it wasn't able to authenticate to them properly. So, I kept trying to get it to debug that process. And after 4 tries, it mocked up the data. It didn't tell me it was mocking it up. It was like, okay, I got us through the step.
Yeah, that's a
See,
Claude
here's
thing.
result. And I'm just like, no,
Claude loves
no,
doing that.
no.
Yeah. That's the Claude model. I actually have in my cursor rules, it says never use mock data for anything unless I very explicitly ask you to do it.
The thing I love best is when it has unit tests that it has to pass, and it marks the number. It's like, well, I couldn't quite get it to work, so I'll just I'll tell you the right answer is this. I'll just plug that in. We're now passed.
That part, I'm just like, oh man. So I have that same rule, right? I'm like, never mock up data. I wonder, I'm kind of curious now, how many of us put that rule in? And if enough of us do it, can we get it to stop doing that? I know I was reading a report that both Anthropic and OpenAI wanted cursor data. They're like, please sell us your data because they just want to see what are people actually doing.
Right. No, there's pretty good. I forget where I read this now, but there's recent papers and lots of documentation showing that the problem is in the reinforcement learning where we train it to go do things that create results as opposed to saying, this is ambiguous, I need clarification. All the reward signals on the, did you solve it or didn't you solve it, right? It's more like a binary.
And that was an OpenAI paper that was released this week. Was
an analogy of a multiple choice question where if you don't guess, you're getting 0. If you guess, on a 4, maybe you have a 25% chance of guessing right. So the models are always rewarded for guessing, basically, in those scenarios. And feels like there's techniques that are now on the reinforced side that are going to bring it back in line. So we'll see. I feel like there's an answer to this problem. It's maybe just not, it wasn't the easiest thing to solve or the next thing to solve yet. But yeah, I have no doubt that we'll get there.
All right, guys. I think we'll bring this to a wrap. It's been a great time spending with you guys. And I think, so what I'm hearing is $10 trillion opportunity, maybe, but there's definitely a lot of specialization that's going to be required.
Yeah, you can be wrong by a lot on a 10 trillion number and it's still a big deal.
Yeah, exactly.
You know what I mean?
Right. And then the other thing I'm sort of taking away is, the forward deployed engineering model, very useful to be thinking about that in terms of if I'm an enterprise and I'm trying to drive benefit, grab some share of that $10 trillion opportunity. That's a good model, making sure, though, that you've got folks that really understand not only how to do prototypes and build code, but also understand the process and understand what the capabilities of the technology are. And then finally, what I'm hearing is agents, especially coding agents, not perfect, but, they've come a long way. And there's a lot that we'll be able to accomplish with those tools if we give them the right context and the right guidance and so on. Anything else?
Really good.
Go ahead.
I think you just gave the very good AI summary for the last hour.
Perfect. That's right. All right.
AI
I am actually AI.
Right, exactly.
All right. Thanks, guys.
See ya.
See you guys.